Here's the lie, stated plainly: hit your number, and you're safe. Save enough, invest it correctly, cross a finish line sometime in your 60s, and the hard part of your financial life is over. It isn't. For a huge number of Americans, the hard part hasn't even started yet. Retirement isn't a finish line. It's the opening day of a 20 to 30 year stretch where four separate forces keep working against your savings the entire time, long after the paycheck that used to replenish them has stopped arriving. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what those four forces are, why the number everyone chases doesn't account for them, and why running out of money in retirement almost never looks like the dramatic collapse people picture. Culturally, retirement gets treated like a single moment, a cake in the break room, a card everyone signs, a photo on the front porch the day the commute finally ends. That framing isn't wrong, exactly. It's just dangerously incomplete. A wedding is a single day. A marriage is decades of ongoing work that the wedding never once tested. Retirement is the marriage, not the wedding, and most of the financial industry still talks about it like the wedding is the hard part. The people most exposed to this particular lie aren't the reckless spenders. It's the disciplined ones, the people who followed every piece of standard advice, maxed out a retirement account for 30 years, hit the number a calculator told them to hit, and then discovered that the number itself was never designed to account for what happens after it's reached. If retirement anxiety has been creeping into your own planning even though you feel like you're doing everything right, this is very likely why. The anxiety isn't irrational. It's a reasonably accurate read of a system that was undersold from the start. Start with the number itself, because even the number is shakier than most people realize. In 1994, a financial advisor named William Benjen ran the math on every 30-year retirement going back to 1926, trying to find the highest withdrawal rate that would have survived even the worst starting year in that entire span. The single worst case in his entire dataset was someone retiring in 1968, right at a market peak, just before a decade of stagnant returns and runaway inflation gutted the value of everything they'd saved. Benjen worked backward from that worst-case retiree specifically. His answer came out to a little over 4%, which got rounded down and became famous as the 4% rule: withdraw 4% of your portfolio the first year, adjust that dollar amount for inflation every year after, and history suggested your money would very likely outlast you over a 30-year retirement. Here's what gets lost when a worst-case number becomes a household rule of thumb. It was built to survive the single unluckiest retirement year in nearly a century, not to describe an average one. Benjen's own data shows the historical average safe withdrawal rate closer to 7%, with some fortunate starting years supporting withdrawal rates as high as 13%. The 4% figure isn't a description of what usually happens. It's an insurance policy against the worst thing that has ever happened, and most people were never told which one they were actually being handed. That single number has quietly become the bedrock of American retirement planning for 3 decades anyway. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Benjen himself has since revised his own rule upward, to somewhere between 4.5% and 4.7%, based on additional decades of data and broader diversification. Meanwhile, one of the most rigorous research shops in the industry has spent the last several years moving in the opposite direction entirely, publishing a starting safe withdrawal rate as low as 3.3% in 2021, and landing closer to 3.7% more recently. The man who invented the rule and the analysts updating it today don't agree with each other within a full percentage point. On $1 million portfolio, that disagreement alone is the difference between roughly $37,000 a year and roughly $47,000. If the experts who study this professionally can't converge on a single safe number, hit your number was never the finish line it was marketed as. It was always a starting estimate, dressed up as a guarantee. The second force is the one almost nobody explains clearly, and it can quietly undo decades of disciplined saving in the first few years of retirement alone: sequence of returns risk. Picture two retirees, each starting with an identical $1 million portfolio, each withdrawing $50,000 a year, each earning the exact same 7% average annual return over the following decade. You'd expect them to end up in roughly the same place. They don't, not even close. Run 3 different paths that all average that same 7% over 10 years. A steady 7% every single year leaves the portfolio at roughly $890,000 after a decade of withdrawals. The exact same average, but with 2 rough early years followed by 8 strong ones, leaves the portfolio closer to $720,000. Flip the order: 8 strong years followed by the 2 rough ones at the end instead, and the same portfolio finishes over $1 million. Identical starting balance. Identical withdrawals. Identical 10-year average return. A gap of over $300,000, created entirely by which years the bad luck happened to land on. The mechanism is simple once you see it. A retiree who sells shares during a downturn to cover a withdrawal locks in that loss permanently. Those specific shares are gone and can no longer participate when the market eventually recovers. A portfolio that's still growing, with no withdrawals coming out of it, can shrug off a bad year and simply wait. A retirement portfolio, with a fixed dollar amount leaving it every single year regardless of what the market is doing, does not have that luxury. This isn't a hypothetical. Someone who retired in January of 2000 walked directly into the dot-com crash within the first 3 years, and the 2008 financial crisis within the first decade. By 2010, after just 10 years of withdrawals, that retiree's portfolio had fallen under $500,000, even accounting for the market's partial recovery. Someone who retired in January of 1982, with the exact same starting balance and the exact same withdrawal strategy, rode the start of one of the longest bull markets in American history instead. By 2020, after the same 10 years of withdrawals, that portfolio had grown past $1.5 million. Same discipline. Same strategy. Same number hit on the exact same terms, by 2 people who did everything the textbooks told them to do. The only difference between them was the calendar page their retirement happened to land on, a variable neither of them controlled and neither of them could have predicted. Research on this exact phenomenon estimates that roughly 3/4 of a retirement portfolio's ultimate fate is explained by nothing more than the returns of its first 10 years. So the calendar decides a huge part of the outcome, and nobody gets to pick their calendar. That's force number 2. Force number 3 doesn't wait for bad luck at all. It's guaranteed, every single year, for every retiree, regardless of what the market happens to be doing. The third force is inflation, and in retirement it behaves nothing like the tame, general inflation figure that shows up in the news. It behaves like a second, faster clock running specifically on the expenses retirees can least avoid. Health care is the clearest example. While general inflation has averaged somewhere around 3% a year, health care costs in the US have consistently climbed 5 to 6% annually, nearly double the pace. Fidelity has tracked what that actually costs a retiree every year since 2002. When their estimate for a single 65-year-old's lifetime health care spending in retirement stood at $80,000. Their 2025 estimate for that same single retiree, $172,500. For a couple, the figure is roughly $345,000, and neither number includes long-term care. an individual turning 65 today has close to a 70% chance of needing some form of long-term care before the end of their life, and a single year in a nursing home now carries a median cost well over $100,000. And Medicare, the program most people assume will simply absorb these costs, comes with its own rising price tag attached. The standard monthly premium for Medicare Part B climbed again for 2026, and higher earners face additional surcharges on top of that base premium that can push the monthly cost several times higher, based on income reported 2 years earlier. Deductibles rise most years too, on both the hospital and outpatient sides of the program. None of this is a one-time expense that gets budgeted for once and forgotten. It's a bill that arrives every single month, for every year of retirement, growing faster than almost anything else in a retiree's budget. This is the enemy Benjen himself, the man who created the 4% rule, now openly calls the greatest threat retirees actually face, greater than any single market crash. The fourth force isn't really a market risk at all. It's a policy risk, and it's the one most people assume is settled when it very much is not. According to the Social Security Administration's own most recent trustees report, the trust fund that pays retirement benefits is projected to become depleted in late 2032. That does not mean payments stop. Ongoing payroll tax revenue would continue funding the program at a reduced level, currently projected at roughly 78% of scheduled benefits, unless Congress changes the law before then. The underlying cause is mostly demographic, not political. In 1966, there were nearly 4 workers paying into the system for every 1 person collecting benefits. Today that ratio has fallen below 3 to 1, and it continues to shrink as the population ages. Independent budget analysts estimate the average monthly benefit cut at that depletion point would be in the neighborhood of $500, with the reduction running higher than that in a majority of states. Public confidence reflects that math. Trust in Social Security's ability to deliver as promised has fallen to its lowest level in 15 years. None of this means Social Security disappears. It does mean that a program tens of millions of retirees have built their plans around carries more uncertainty today than the phrase safety net tends to suggest. Put these 4 forces together, and the picture of running out of money in retirement looks completely different from the one most people imagine. It's rarely one catastrophic mistake, a single bad investment or a reckless purchase. It's a starting withdrawal rate borrowed from a debate the experts themselves haven't settled, colliding with a bad first decade of market returns, colliding with health care costs compounding at nearly double the general inflation rate, colliding with a government program quietly running on a smaller share of its original promise. None of these 4 forces asks permission, and none of them announce themselves with a single dramatic headline. All 4 are already in motion for anyone currently retired, and all 4 keep running for as long as retirement itself lasts, which today can easily stretch past 30 years for a healthy 65-year-old. This is also why running out of money so rarely looks the way people picture it. Nobody wakes up one morning to a zero balance out of nowhere. It's a slow erosion at a withdrawal rate that felt comfortable in year 1 starts feeling tight by year 12, a health scare adds a monthly expense nobody budgeted for, a couple of rough market years early on never quite get made up. By the time it becomes an emergency, it's usually been building quietly for the better part of a decade. So what do you actually do with all of that? Stop treating any single withdrawal number as gospel, including 4%. Build a plan that can flex, spending a bit less in years the market performs poorly and a bit more in years it doesn't, rather than locking in one fixed figure for 3 decades regardless of what the market is doing. A flexible strategy that adjusts to actual conditions consistently outperforms a rigid one in the research on this topic, even when the rigid one starts with a higher number on paper. Protect the first 5 to 10 years specifically, since research shows they matter more than any other stretch of the entire retirement. Keeping a cash or short-term bond buffer large enough to cover a couple of years of expenses means a bad market year doesn't force you to sell shares at the worst possible moment. That buffer is effectively insurance against exactly the scenario the January 2000 retiree lived through, and it costs nothing to arrange except deciding to hold a slightly more conservative mix in those specific early years. Price health care honestly, years before you retire, not as an afterthought. A health savings account, if you have access to one, is one of the only accounts in the entire tax code that goes in tax-free, grows tax-free, and comes out tax-free for medical expenses, and it's worth treating as a dedicated retirement account in its own right rather than a pass-through for this year's doctor visits. Diversify your income sources the same way you diversify a portfolio. Anyone planning a retirement that leans entirely on one pillar, whether that's a portfolio, a pension, or Social Security alone, is making a bet on that single pillar holding up exactly as promised for 3 decades straight. A retirement built on 3 or 4 smaller income streams instead of one large one can absorb a hit to any single one of them without the entire plan collapsing. Revisit the plan regularly instead of setting it once and assuming it holds. The 4% rule, the healthcare estimates, and the Social Security projections in this video are all snapshots of conditions as they stand today. Every one of them will keep shifting over the next 30 years, and a plan that gets reviewed annually can adjust to that shift instead of getting blindsided by it a decade in. And treat a real financial or retirement professional as part of the plan, not a luxury reserved for people who've already made it. The math involved in withdrawal sequencing, tax-efficient account ordering, and long-term care planning is genuinely complicated enough that a few hours of professional guidance routinely pays for itself many times over, and nothing in this video is a substitute for advice tailored to your specific numbers, health, and timeline. The real lie was never a specific number being wrong. It was the idea that retirement has a finish line at all. It doesn't. It's the start of the longest, most consequential financial stretch most people will ever navigate, running for decades against inflation, against market timing, and against a system that no longer guarantees quite what it once did. Nobody warned most people about that on purpose. It wasn't a conspiracy, just an industry that found it easier to sell a single reassuring number than to explain for moving, interacting risks in the same breath. Now you know all for anyway, with enough time left to actually plan for the fight instead of just the finish line that was never really there.